Tell me, please, Poffrey, he began in order to say something. Why? I've always wanted to ask you about it in person. Why are you called Pseldonimov instead of Pseudonimov? Your name surely must be Pseudonimov. I cannot inform you exactly, Your Excellency, said Pseldonimov. It must have been when his father went into the service they made a mistake in his papers, so that he has remained Pseldonimov, put in Akim Petrovitch. That does happen. Undoubtedly, the general said with warmth. Undoubtedly, for only think, Pseldonimov comes from literary word pseudonymov comes from the literary word pseudonym. Well, pseudonymov means nothing. Due to foolishness, added Akim Petrovitch. You mean what is due to foolishness? The Russian common people, in their foolishness, often alter letters, and sometimes pronounce them in their own way. For instance, they say Nelvalid instead of invalid. Oh yes, Nelvalid. Mumber, too. They say, Your Excellency, boomed out at the tall officer, who had long been itching to distinguish himself in some way. What do you mean by mumber? Mumber instead of number, Your Excellency. Oh yes, mumber instead of number. To be sure, to be sure. He he. Even Ilyich had to do a chuckle for the benefit of the officer too. The officer straightened his tie. Another thing is to say nigh by, the young man on the comic paper put in, but His Excellency tried not to hear this. His chuckles were not at everyone's disposal. Nigh by instead of near, the young man on the comic paper persisted in evident irritation. Even Ilyich looked at him sternly. Come, why persist? Pseldonimov whispered to him. Why, I was talking. Mayn't one speak? The latter protested in a whisper. But he said no more, and, with secret fury, walked out of the room. He made his way straight to the attractive little back room, where, for the benefit of the dancing gentlemen, vodka of two sorts, saltfish, caviar into slices, and a bottle of very strong sherry of Russian make had been set early in the evening out on a little table, covered with a Yaroslav cloth. With anger in his heart, he was pouring himself out a glass of vodka when, suddenly, the medical student with the dishevelled locks, the foremost dancer and cutter of carpets at Soldonov's ball, rushed in. He fell on the decanter with greedy haste. They're just going to begin, he said, rapidly helping himself. Come on and look. I'm going to dance a solo on my head. After supper I shall risk the fish dance. It's just the thing for a wedding, so to speak. A friendly hint to Pseldonimov. She's a jolly creature, that Cleopatra Selmondova. You can venture on anything you'd like with her. He's a reactionary, said the young man on the comic paper gloomily as he tossed off his vodka. Who is a reactionary? Why, the personage before whom they set those sweetmeats. He's a reactionary, I tell you. What nonsense, muttered the student, and he rushed out of the room, hearing the opening bars of the quadrille. Left alone, the young man on the comic paper poured himself out another glass to give himself more assurance and independence. He drank and ate a snack of something, and never had the actual civil councillor, even Ilyich, made for himself a bitterer foe, more implacable bent on revenge, than was the young man on the staff of the firebrand, whom he had so slighted, especially after the latter had drunk 2 glasses of vodka. Alas, even Ilyich suspected nothing of the sort. He did not suspect another circumstance of prime importance either, which had an influence on the mutual relations of the guests and His Excellency. The fact was that though he had given a proper and even detailed explanation of his presence at his clerk's wedding, this explanation did not really satisfy anyone, and the visitors were still embarrassed. But suddenly everything was transformed as though by magic. All were reassured and ready to enjoy themselves, to laugh, to shriek, to dance, exactly as though the unexpected visitor were not in the room. The cause of it was a rumor, a whisper, a report which spread in some unknown way that the visitor was not quite, it seemed, was, in fact, a little top-heavy, and though this seemed at first a horrible calumny, it began by degree to appear to be justified. Suddenly everything became clear. What was more, they felt at once extraordinarily free. It was just at this moment that the quadrille for which the medical student was in such haste, the last before supper, began. Just as Ivan Ilyitch meant to address the bride again, intending to provoke her with some innuendo, the tall officer suddenly dashed up to her and with a flourish dropped to one knee before her. She immediately jumped up from the sofa and whisked off with him to take her place in the quadrille. The officer did not even apologize, and she did not even glance at the general as she went away. She seemed, in fact, relieved to escape. After all, she has a right to be, thought Ivan Ilyitch, and of course they don't know how to behave. Don't you stand on ceremony, friend Porfiry, he said, addressing Pseldonimov. Perhaps you have arrangements to make, or something. Please don't put yourself out. Why does he keep guard over me? He thought to himself. Pseldonimov, with his long neck and his eyes fixed intently upon him, began to be insufferable. In fact, all this was not the thing at all, but Ivan Ilyitch was still far from admitting this. The quadrille began. "Will you allow me, your Excellency?" asked Akim Petrovitch, holding the bottle respectfully in his hands and preparing to pour it into his Excellency's glass. I really don't know whether—" But Akim Petrovitch, with a reverent and radiant face, was already filling the glass. After filling the glass, he proceeded, writhing and wriggling, as it were steadily, as it were furtively, to pour himself out some, with the difference that he did not fill his own glass to within a finger length of the top, and this seemed somehow more respectful. He was like a woman in travail as he sat beside his chief. What could he talk about, indeed? Yet to entertain his Excellency was an absolute duty, since he had the honor of keeping him company. The champagne served as a resource, and his Excellency, too, was pleased that he had filled his glass, not for the sake of the champagne, but for it was warm and perfectly abominable, but just morally pleased. The old chap would like to have a drink himself, thought Ivan Ilyitch, but he doesn't want to venture till I do. I mustn't prevent him, and indeed it would be absurd for the bottle to stand between as untouched. He took a sip. Anyway, it seemed better than sitting doing nothing. "I am here," he said, with pauses and emphasis. "I am here, so to speak, accidentally, and of course, it may be that some people would consider it seemed it unseemly for me to be at such a gathering." Akim Petrovitch said nothing, but listened with timid curiosity. "But I hope you will understand with what object I have come. I haven't really come simply to drink wine." Akim Petrovitch tried to chuckle, following the example of his Excellency, but again he could not get it out, and again he made absolutely no consolatory answer. "I am here in order to speak, to encourage, to show, so to speak, a moral aim," Ivan Ilyitch continued, feeling vexed at Akim Petrovitch's stupidity. But he suddenly subsided into silence himself. He saw that poor Akim Petrovitch had dropped his eyes as though he were in fault. The general, in some confusion, made haste to take another sip from his glass, and Akim Petrovitch clutched at the bottle as though it were his only hope of salvation, and filled the glasses again. You haven't many resources," thought Ivan Ilyitch, looking sternly at poor Akim Petrovitch. The latter, feeling the stern, general-like eye upon him, made up his mind to remain silent for good, and not to raise his eyes. So they sat beside each other for a couple of minutes. 2 sickly minutes for Akim Petrovitch. A couple of words about Akim Petrovitch. He was a man of the old school, as meek as a hen, reared from infancy to obsequious servility, and at the same time a good-natured and even honorable man. He was a Petersburg Russian, that is, his father and his father's father were born, grew up, and served in Petersburg, and had never once left Petersburg. That is quite a special type of Russian. They have hardly any idea of Russia, though that does not trouble them at all. Their whole interest is confined to Petersburg, and chiefly the place in which they serve. All their thoughts are concentrated on preference for farthing points on shop and their month's salary. They don't know a single Russian custom, a single Russian song except Lashchutinka, Lutchinuska, and that only because it is played on the barrel organs. However, There are two fundamental and invariable signs by which you can at once distinguish a Petersburg Russian from a real Russian. The first sign is the fact that Petersburg Russians, all without exception, speak of the newspaper as the academic news, and never call it the Petersburg news. The second, and equally trustworthy sign, is that Petersburg Russians never make use of the word breakfast, but always call it frühstück, with an especial emphasis on the first syllable. By these radical and distinguishing signs, you can tell them apart. In short, this is a humble type which has been formed during the last 35 years. Akim Petrovitch, however, was by no means a fool. If the general had asked him a question about anything in his own province, he would have answered and kept up a conversation. As it was unseemly for a subordinate to even answer such questions as these, though Akim Petrovitch was dying from curiosity to know something more detailed about his Excellency's real intentions. And meanwhile, Ivan Ilyitch sank more and more into meditation and a sort of whirl of ideas. In his absorption, he sipped his glass every half-minute. Akim Petrovitch at once zealously filled it up. Both were silent. Ivan Ilyitch began looking at the dances, and immediately something attracted his attention. One circumstance even surprised him.